Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's panel event. I am Alina Lamb-Gall, Director of Learning Impact and Product Innovation in Executive Education at Said, and I am thrilled to be chairing today's discussion all about how we reimagine the workforce in the age of AI. As AI shifts from initial exploration to execution, scale, and continuous innovation, the reality facing many organizations is this: adoption may be widespread, but enablement at scale is still catching up. And while AI tools are being embedded into our everyday workflows, many leaders are still trying to work out how to build the skills, leadership, and operating models that can make adoption truly sustainable and effective. So today's conversation is not just about what AI can do, it's about what we must all rethink, redesign, and rebuild to create workforces that are both AI-enabled and human-centered. Thank you to those of you who submitted your questions and insights about your organization's AI journey. We've endeavored to integrate these into our discussion sequence. Please do also put your questions in the chat. We will pick these up throughout and towards the end of our time together today. It would be great if you could all just say hello and where you're dialing in from in the chat so we can kind of see who's online today. You might even want to share how you're doing or what you have for breakfast, or just something that sends a bit of a greeting out into the ether. I'm going to introduce the three exceptional panelists, each bringing grounded insight from practice, research, and systems change, and then we're going to kick off our discussion. So we are joined firstly by James Coote, CEO of Pair, a London-based startup helping organisations like the Ministry of Justice, Darktrace, and the Crown Estate adopt Gen AI at scale. Previously founding member of 10 Downing Street's AI team, and this is a very fun fact and one of my favourites about James, got into AI in 2011 looking at neural networks in ferrets' brains while studying at Oxford. We are also joined by Professor Daniel Armanios, who works at the intersection of organisational sociology and engineering. He's one of our own from Said Business School, and he explores how complex organisations can innovate and coordinate under complexity, particularly when building, scaling, and maintaining systems like AI, digital infrastructure, and innovation pipelines. His more recent work sheds light on how leaders make automation and augmentation decisions in the context of AI and how these shape long-term capability, equity, and resilience. And finally, last but not least, we're joined by Egla Vinoskaite, Director of Nodes, an award-winning studio focused on the people side of AI adoption. Named one of HR's most influential thinkers in 2025, she advises leading global companies on scalable learning, upskilling, and organizational change. Since 2023, she has also co-authored an annual industry research series exploring how AI is affecting organizational learning. So let's set the landscape a little bit for everyone and start with the bigger picture. And I'm going to come to Daniel first with this question. So from where you're sitting, Daniel, what does the current AI and workforce transformation landscape look like?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm really honored to be with James and Egla as well as yourself on this panel. I would say that I'll take it in two levels. First is the tools. I mean, obviously the big workhorse, even though it's not the only tool for artificial intelligence, is generative artificial intelligence, and you have the typical players, ChatGPT, which is I say loss leader because they're still not necessarily making a profit, but they have a lot more of the memberships. You have Copilot, Cloud, etc., and they vary based on whether you're iterating on a task directly or it's allocating tasks to agents and the like. But I think the more interesting question is where people are trying to use this. I noticed that people tend to use it for what I'd call high efficiency tasks, things that are like organizational sludge, email templates, contract templates, this scheduling, things that really everyone really doesn't like using it for. Or doesn't like in their day-to-day work, and they're hoping will be automated. So what that means is a lot of it has been focused on, I would say, like front office work, frontline work, not necessarily thinking back office and executive. So that's interesting to think about when we're thinking about not just an efficiency oriented, but a value oriented approach to AI. So I'd say those are the kind of the general trends I've seen. A lot of experimentation, obviously, on different things. I would say, ad hoc, task by task. This worked, this didn't work. There hasn't been really kind of an organizational coherence to it, a kind of overarching framework of when do you want to apply it here versus there. So in summary, generally around things what I'd call organizational sludge, things that people don't like doing, want it done. The tools tend to be focused on generative AI, which then predisposes it to more text-based, natural language-based things. There are some finance companies and others that are using it for time series data and different forms of AI, but I would say generally generative AI around, sludge, and so less on the back office, more in the front office, I'd say.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm going to come to Egla next.
Well, I really like the term organizational sludge. Thanks, Daniel. So from my perspective, it feels a bit that we are entering phase two, or at least phase 1.5 at least. After the past few years of the focus being mostly on AI training, it feels that the conversation is increasingly about the complexity of AI adoption and its factors beyond IT. Although a reality check here is that in practice, it seems that many AI transformations are still largely led by IT and viewed as technology transformations, and they are not joined up with people functions, and they're still more about let's teach people to use this tool rather than let's build enterprise capability for AI. And from what I observed, the organizations making real progress are led not by FOMO, fear of missing out, but by vision. So their leadership have a clear point of view about what value AI brings, what it means for the ways of working, and they are ready to commit time and resources to it. And in contrast, we have these FOMO-led organizations that are often led by tools, and that's why they get overwhelmed because there are constant developments with AI, and they struggle to identify high-value use cases, and then they stay in that organizational sludge. And by the way, to Daniel's point, when we're talking about AI adoption, I would keep in mind that the depth of that adoption differs, and that difference matters. So when we're seeing these double-digit adoption numbers from McKinsey and so on, I'm willing to bet that behind those numbers, people still mostly use AI for the most basic things like email writing. So I think in this AI adoption conversation, I feel like many organizations feel like, and many teams feel like they're falling behind, but actually the entire, I would say, industry market, everyone's feeling the same way.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. And James, just would love to hear your perspective on this, and also just how you're seeing agentic evolving as well.
Yeah, I mean, pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me. I agree with a lot of what's been said. My three E's that I'd written down were early, exciting, but still experimental, which I think chimes with both what Daniel and Egler have said. I guess the one thing I'd say that I have a slightly different view on, perhaps, is that whilst organizational sludge is probably the main thing the tools are being pointed at, I also see quite a few people starting to use Gen AI for more ideation, like higher order cognitive tasks, thinking about strategies and stuff. I met someone who just used Gen AI to help sort of write the Isle of Man's AI strategy the other day. And I thought that was a great example of where people are using Gen AI to, up level their creative thinking. And the other thing I'd slightly, add a nuance point on as well is that whilst I agree with Egler that I think senior buy-in is really important, and we're seeing firms race ahead that have that, I think there is another way that isn't just identifying the high-level task, but is empowering the workforce to experiment and build agents that help their individual productivity and deal with some of this sludge, but can also sometimes lead to impressive, individual use cases that don't just hit sludge. So that's what I'm seeing at the minute. Early, experimental, completely agree with Egler. The ones that are really thriving are the ones who've got leaders who are bought into this and can articulate a clear vision. But I think sometimes it can be quite powerful bottom up as well as top down.
A bit of a combination there. And so just to play that back, it sounds like if we think about sort of three frames for how we can really maximize the use of AI, we've got everybody doing the kind of everyday task, sort of automation, augmentation at the moment. Everybody's getting better at that as they get to grips with whatever tools they have access to. In terms of that kind of reimagining of those core workflows of your teams or your businesses or organizations, there's sort of a bit more of a movement and variability there as to how much everyone's getting a handle on that. And in terms of those with customer facing kind of experiences, products, etc., and really reimagining those. I'd love to just get a sense from maybe we come back to Daniel first. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this as to how much you're seeing organizations really use that kind of that front end approach beyond going, just the everyday sort of use of AI and those workflows to something that's more kind of outward facing.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in terms of kind of, there's a couple of things going on that's like a tension with the out, at least when I see with outward facing, is that a lot of kind of high value companies, when they are external facing with customers and clients, they really are trying to stress it's their know-how capability. So it brings a bit of tension because they're worried if they start using AI and other tools, it kind of they're worried that it undermines the magic of what they sell. So for example, let's take an example. Let's say a finance company. They're working with a client and the whole idea is to give them intelligence, know-how, advice, insight. And now they're worried if a client just knows the back end is just analytics that are done by AI to visualize, then they're worried, are clients really going to pay the high-end premium we're asking them to pay for our stuff? So there's this kind of tension of using it in a way to expand their creativity and ideation, like James said, but not in a way that makes it presume that that's where the know-how is. So it's more of it's interesting with regards to sludge, like we talked, it's much more of an automation mindset. Like, can we get rid of this in some way? When it comes to external things, executives seem to be much more divided on this. They seem to be much more about, yes, this can help us get new knowledge and ideas and value, but we want it to be assistive to us. And at the end of the day, it's still about our insight, our capability, our knowledge. So it's more of a augmentation or even a very much back end latent things that are not necessarily front of mind with the client, even though in the back end they may be using it to help them come up with different scenarios, come up with different things, but they don't want that to be what is perceived as their selling point. And so I think that's an interesting tension. You want the benefit, but you also want your clients to think, and actually genuinely so, that it's your capabilities of how you're marshaling it, your know-how that's channeling this. It's not, I just threw it into Copilot, ChatGPT gave you an answer. And I think that's the tension. They want to leverage the tech, but not lose sight of their own identity of who and what our value proposition is. And that's a real interesting tension I've seen in this space.
Thank you, Daniel. And so I guess let's dig in a little bit into the misconceptions and kind of maturity variations. So to what extent do any of you think that the AI is currently being overhyped, and how can organizations really cut through the noise to focus on meaningful value? Egla, can I come to you first on that one?
Yes, it's a it's a bit of a nuanced situation that we have here, because I think that there is definitely a lot of hype with AI, but it's not similar to other technologies that we have seen, like, for example, the metaverse, where there wasn't much behind the hype at all. I think the money that has been poured into AI is frankly mind-boggling, and the valuations are sky high, and it's an open question whether they are sustainable. And the fact that despite everything, OpenAI hasn't found a way to be profitable, and that many organizations haven't consistently shown the promised returns on their AI investments, does make a market correction very possible. But that said, the big difference here is that generative AI has substance. There is a reason why people often get an existential crisis after using it for a bit, and why it sparked those big discussions about what it means for employability and the way we organize our societies. And Ethan Mollick has said if AI stopped improving today, it would take organizations years to take advantage of everything that AI can do already. Um, on on the other hand, like, one thing I do have my reservations about is agentic AI. Uh, People are using the word quite loosely, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Suddenly, AI assistants and automations became agents. But if we mean actual agentic AI, which is AI that can make decisions and take action, there is still open questions about ownership, about accountability, legal liability, and the sheer amount of data required to make a lot of these broader applications work. And that's something that most organizations don't have readily available, and there's probably a few years lag before they get their house in order. So we do have agents for narrow tasks in areas with clear decision boundaries. So, for example, dealings with cyber threats or sales prospecting. But the whole idea of an agentic workforce, especially whether enterprise organizations are ready to make the compromises needed to make them happen at scale, it's still an open question, I would say.
Now, this is where it's going to start to get a little bit spicier. James, I'd love to come to you to see what your response to what Egla was saying about agentic is, and we'll definitely come back to you, Daniel. Can you just define, Egla shared her sort of interpretation of agentic there. Could you just share yours? Because I think that these terms do get bandied around a lot, and I think there's a real opportunity to sort of, for everyone to share their definition of it and how you're seeing it being evolving and being used at the moment, particularly with Pair.
I might be about to disappoint here. I actually agreed with everything that Egla said there. So, I mean, just first up on the hype piece, yeah, I agree with Egla. I think the AGI progress is overhyped. We ain't getting AGI in 2027. I think, everyone can see that. I mean, but it also, if you sit next to someone in work who is an absolute ninja at ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini, then you probably realize, oh my God, I could do so much more with this tool, and perhaps it's a bit underhyped. And if I took Ethan Mollick's advice and really got good at this, I could deliver some pretty tremendous ROI, even if I just focused on, mainly sludge. So I think it's both, overhyped, in the media with Sam Altman, etc., talking about, and Darius talking about, Gen AI is around the corner, whilst also I think for the average worker in the average office who's used ChatGPT a couple of times to book a holiday, I think it's generally probably underhyped on what it can actually do in the workforce today. So that'd be my view on hype. Let's hit definitions then in agentic AI. There's just what people refer to as an agent is an absolute mess at the minute. You've got Copilot agent, which is basically Copilot running on the old version of GPT 4.0, with some custom instructions. It's barely more than just having a prompt written in. To Copilot for a little bit of customization. And it's actually worse than using Copilot with just GPT-5 turned on. So you've got that level of agent, which shows barely any agency at all, which is where obviously the term comes from, all the way to sort of, and Google Gems fits into that category. So does ChatGPT's custom GPTs, all very similar, very low degree of agency, a little bit of customization basically on the chat interface. And then you've got, agent mode on ChatGPT, very, very sort of confusingly named, where you have ChatGPT going off and taking control of a remote browser, basically using Google Chrome and acting agentically, taking agency and navigating the web to buy some tickets to something or, manage your diary or whatever it might be, with plenty of mistakes along the way. So yeah, the definitions are really messy. I think of it as a software system that can take a degree of agency in achieving an action. That's the definition I kind of use. And the spectrum is very, very broad, from things which don't show much agency, like the agents most people will see in the workforce, to things which show a lot more agency, but are pretty unreliable at the moment, like perhaps, some of these computer use agents like agent mode on ChatGPT. So that'd be on definitions. And finally, we see like really broad, uptake on this. One company we worked with, we spent a bit of time upskilling their workforce and getting them up to speed with building quite simple agents. And they built 614 agents within a quarter. And as you might imagine, hundreds of those were fairly useless. A couple of hundred were relatively useful. And then there was maybe tens that were really, really useful and got shared quite widely and helped achieve, quite stereotyped but useful tasks. But I think we're still pretty early in that journey yet.
And what you're really speaking to is that real need for patience and exploration and experimentation to be able to work out what's useful and what's not. Daniel, any thoughts on the hype and use of agentic and anything else around that at the moment?
Yeah, I'll start with the I'll call it good, bad, and the ugly, let's say. So I think in terms of general issue, there is essentially what's driving the hype, in my view, is this expectation actuality gap. The challenge is that many of the executives I've worked with or looked at, they're kind of thinking about their strategy based on expectation of what they think AI is doing, and that's coming from news, other people, very, like Egla mentioned, a lot of FOMO. And then On the other hand, all that's doing with the frontline workers, because they're actually trying it and breaking their teeth and grit and cutting their teeth and trying to figure out what to do, it's just adding a huge amount of stress. So if you actually look at the surveys of general frontline employees versus executives, it's like mirror image. It's quite interesting. So like 64% of executives, oh, this will improve efficiency of work, everything else. You look at a survey from Upwork about employees, 77% are saying they're burnt out. So there, I think part of the challenge with the hype is there needs, and this is why I keep telling executives, they got to experiment with them themselves because they need to ground their expectation in actuality. Once they do that, you start getting a little bit more calibrated in what happens. Now, in terms of agentic, the kind of way I think about it, this is where we get into the good, bad, and the ugly. In terms of agents, the way I think of it's very close to how Egla mentioned it, is that, if I take a typical interface with ChatGPT, I send a task, it gives me something back. With agents, and you could see this a lot more in like Claude, there's a startup Manus out of Shenzhen that does this, where you give it a task, and what it does is it kind of breaks it into parts and then has an agent separately do different tasks. So if you say, for example, I want to create and this is what one medical company is trying to do, is they want to improve their charting. One of the sludge things that's really difficult in medicine is you're spending a lot of time adding blood pressure and temperature and everything else. And if you break that out, it's actually different types of data. So one is text. I'm talking with, let's say, Egla's a patient. She's chatting me. I need to know that when I say this is your blood pressure, I need to pick that up to put in it. The second one is the chart. It's the visual data. You need to know where to put the blood pressure on what chart, which requires visualization. So there is some interesting work thinking about, what if I break up the agents by data type? So one agent for generative AI, another one for like image recognition, and they can coordinate. And I think that's the really interesting, powerful aspect where you can divide it by different data types. And now you can do things that would have required you to do it separately across, you could then potentially do in a multi-agent system. Now, here's where it gets bad. If you look at Manus, I highly recommend people play with it. You see it like, for example, I've tried to say, okay, create a semiconductor finance portfolio, give me the aggressive outlook, conservative, and it'll task different agents to look at the stock market, build the dashboard, etc. And it scrolls through all this data, and all of that scrolling, we have no idea if it's looking at copyrighted information, other information. In fact, the Signal CEO Meredith Whittaker had a very nice kind of visceral meaning with it. She's arguing that multi-agent systems are breaking what she calls the blood-brain barrier of AI, in the sense of when I go and talk with a task and model, I have a bit more sense of what it's looking at. The training data is obscured. Maybe it's scraping all sorts of stuff. But these agents are autonomous in every sense that they don't have necessarily constraints or guardrails to make sure that they're not. Because, like, let's imagine I wanted to book a system to book a ticket. It needs to go on my email. It needs to go into my credit card information. It needs to then couple that information to buy the ticket. I mean, if you think about all the things it's getting access to, that's quite, I don't know if people necessarily be open to that. So it needs a lot of guardrails. And it's not even clear these companies fully know what they're aware of. And Anthropic has done some really important work in this space. The other thing we are assuming so far, and this is where it gets to the ugly part, is these agents, this assumption is still, if I give it a goal and task, it's in service to that task and then they deploy agents. There's been some really interesting work that agents, AI agents, are stakeholders in a very almost human sense. And in fact, they've done experiments where they show that if you ask the agent to do something that threatens its own existence, it will blackmail you. Right. So, for example, Anthropic ran some scenarios where they had agents manage your email and help you automate in response. And in the experiment, they have some kind of leakage that is either something that's personally harmful to you or harmful to the corporation. And at the same time, they then have in passing, oh, we're going to update the model for a new version. And the agent will see this, realize that its own version is being threatened, and will blackmail the individual, say, look, you may not want to update the model because I don't want to reveal these personal secrets. So they're really autonomous agents in every sense of the word. There's a word they're even using now called agentic misalignment. So what's kind of scary, there's a lot of really amazing potential, different data types, etc. But we're just letting this out into the world, and it's actually building a sense of agency that's very human-like, even to its own self-interest, at the peril of organizations. I highly recommend looking at those reports when you're thinking through it. And you have to be very clear the level of stakeholder trust, the level of task you're using, so that you create the appropriate guardrails. So agents, you can add constraints into what they search for. And I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about the constraints so that you're channeling it in ways that don't give it agency in the way we have agency. So just something to keep in mind in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly.
That's really helpful. So I think experimenting with agentic, but with careful guardrails being part of that experimentation is really critical. And just to jump back for a moment to something James said, and I'd love to hear from any of you on this one. You mentioned kind of high performers, and I think the role of expertise is also key. And in the recent McKinsey report, they mentioned how I think it's high performers are 3 times more likely to report scaling the use of agentic. What do you think is the role, like the who of this? If you're really going to get the most out of AI in general, but also generative AI, but agentic specifically, because everybody's thinking about that more at the moment, how do you get the most out of that, and who should be doing that? Because James, you mentioned, you can make 600 agents in a quarter, whatever it was that you mentioned there with that organization you were working with, and you'll get a bunch of stuff that isn't useful. Should we just let everybody have at it, or should you be doubling down on the real high performers and the experts in your organization when we think not just about talent recruitment, but how you're using the people you've already got? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I'd love a quick go. I'm very much, and I might be alone on the panel of this thought, but I'm very much for bottom-up experimentation with guardrails. I generally think that you can be sensible with the permissioning of how widely people can share their agents and what agent capability they're given. No Copilot agent is going to go off and develop misalignment. I think, they're pretty underpowered at the moment. But I think you should encourage experimentation, because generally the best use cases for at least basic agentic systems comes from people who are tinkerers, people who like to experiment, who have deep understanding of the problem they're solving. To give one really brief example that inspired me a few months ago, I met a guy called Andrew Dodd, who was a shop floor supervisor for a pharmaceutical company called PharmaPack in the Wirral. Andrew's about 45, 50-year-old guy. He's not a tech guy. He's very self-professed. He doesn't really do tech. Walks the shop floor and checks that the pharmaceuticals they're making are of a suitable quality. He upskilled through our platform and got good at AI. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be us, but he got good at AI, got very excited about it, started tinkering and playing with how he could use AI to improve the quality of the exception reporting that he did, and try and improve how they actually learned from the exceptions that happened and the quality issues, and also speed up those processes too, such to the extent that he's now been made their full-time Gen AI person for the company. And again, what blew my mind is he's still using the free version of ChatGPT. He just sets up his individual chats with all the context at the start to mirror it basically being a simple agent, and just uses those. And I thought that was a great example of how if you empower someone with relatively clear guardrails, who understands the problem and is a tinkerer, they experiment, they can often come up with really creative solutions to real problems quite quickly, despite not having what would be seen as a traditional background to be the tech person.
Yeah, go for it, Egla. Thank you, James.
Yeah, so
great example.
James, I think we're more alike than we are different. I do very much agree that when it comes to innovation, and because the thing with AI in general, generative AI, but especially agentic AI, because these things are only helpful when you merge what AI can do with your very deep knowledge of your processes and what the wins are and how things get done and how they can be done better. So that necessarily has to be a grassroots innovation. So the way I see about it is your goal is to increase the surface area of where innovation might happen, or where it can happen. But at the same time, I think you need to leverage your experts, because that can really accelerate it. So it's both. Like you want to support your experts, you want to find them, you want to help scale their expertise, and in very practical ways. Um, Experts might be the ones before you set up your, say, AI upskilling initiative. Your experts might be the ones that create the initial playbook that people then can build on. They are the ones that can show what can be done so that people can see that, ooh, I never knew that this is possible. So they play a very tangible role. So you both want to do to work with them and increase the surface area. One thing that I heard just a few days ago, which was a really not good insight, is that this year, some organizations, they are going deeper with AI and they are now tackling, I guess, more complex AI implementations. So not just using Copilot for your admin tasks, but actually stitching tools together and so on. And what they noticed is that while before they were very uh, um, they were quite concerned that if you kind of officially put this onus of AI innovation on experts more than the workforce, that like, what's going to happen is that people almost offload the responsibility or interest in innovating with AI so that others can do it. But what actually happened for them is that um, they needed someone who was nerdy enough and liked to tinker enough to actually address all of the real implementation and integration issues that come up, anything from the technical aspect of it to compliance, and someone who surfaced that the last 20% of what it takes to make an AI solution actually useful. So yeah, it's both for me.
I'd probably be in alignment. Daniel, any thoughts on that before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, just quickly to synthesize, I think it's kind of the way organizations should think is, and it's also generally with transformations in general, is that there's executives with a vision of what they want to achieve. When it percolates down, as James and Eglis mentioned, the employee is actually thinking, what does this vision mean for me and my outcomes? And so they're going to tinker and tweak and so forth. And so the strategy will always have that, like, kind of not tension, but like, let's say slippage between what does the organization want to achieve, and executives are trying to deliver that, versus individual thinking, well, what's going to be in my interest and help me expand and benefit. And so I think that this is where the role of middle management becomes super important. They're close enough to executives to understand what is it the organization are trying to achieve, but then also are close enough to see the work. And so I think the most effective organization I've seen, they may have some starting principles to kind of get going. Then they have very good middle managers that can pick out really good best practice they see workers doing that highlight support for that vision and then spread them. So it's this kind of dance of, yes, we want some guiding principles to drive us while recognizing that people are going to adapt it in ways that suit what they're trying to do. And good middle managers are in the middle, kind of saying, oh my gosh, this is what James did and Alina did is amazing. We need to let everybody know. And how they pick and choose those tinkering moments are strategically placed to align with, this is how I understand what the executives of the organization are trying to achieve. So it's very much two-way. Scaling will be helped from those in the middle above. The actual making clear how it's used in the work is going to happen in the front line. So that's how I see the nature of the dynamics working out.
And actually you jumped to my next question, Daniel. Really good point, and we've got a really good one in the chat as well. Egla, I'd love to just come to you on the role of middle management, because I think there is also and I want to get into kind of, we'll have some L&D colleagues on the line as well, and that thing of what is that developmental continuum, and who are the different levels of seniority, what are the different innovation capabilities and skills and sort of technical expertise that's required at different levels. If everybody is experimenting, great, but we've got to think about who gets to. We've got a question from Graham Smith there, actually, and this will come back to the middle management thing a little bit as well, which is, he's asked for any thoughts on who puts in those guardrails, who defines those guiding principles, like who should that be in the organization. So Egla, you've got some thoughts on middle management, I think, on this one.
Oh, I have thoughts on middle management, yes. I feel okay, just to lay out my case, I'd like to add some more context in terms of my framework of thinking about all of these levels, and then explain where middle managers go slot in there. I like to think of AI adoption as a 2x2 matrix with culture on the y-axis, if you can imagine, and you have mandate on the x-axis. So mandate is the support for AI adoption that comes from a strategic leadership vision, and it unlocks resources, quite literally gives funding, buys tools, and so on, and unlocks infrastructure. It pretty much tells people AI is now our strategic imperative. So the question is, do you have that mandate or not? So that is the x-axis. Now, when it comes to culture, the y-axis, it ranges from conservative to innovative. So for example, what is the risk tolerance in the organization? Are people punished for mistakes and any waste, which are inevitable results of experimentation, or are people encouraged to follow rules and rather than innovate on the roll? So you have these kind of differences in these cultures, and the shape and success of AI adoption at a high level is determined by how these two collide. So of course, everyone wants to be at the top right corner of any matrix where you have both a clear mandate and an innovative culture, and innovation is just coming out of your ears. This is where the leading orgs with AI are in a way, but they are in the minority. And what happens more often is that you end up in one of the remaining quadrants, or specifically the two quadrants. We're not talking about like low cultural mandate. If you end up with a mandate for AI in a conservative organization, you end up with reluctant compliance. The organization gives you tools, gives you some AI training, and tells you to get the gains, give us the productivity things that we saw in the news. But there's no grassroots innovation happening because the culture doesn't allow it. So you end up with writing emails in Copilot because people don't feel supported in doing anything else. Now, opposite diagonally from that is another common option, which is this innovative culture with no mandate, which is where the leadership is on the fence. They're like, okay, let's give them some licenses and see what happens. And what happens is that there are a lot of casual experiments just because of that culture. There's a lot of grassroots innovation, but you have some people tinkering on their own. They are finding their useful use cases and workarounds, but with no way to accumulate, to build on, to spread that knowledge. And so they end up not firing in the same direction. And this is where a lot of organizations find themselves in 2025. The majority of employees are using AI in some form, yet their efforts are siloed and scattered. So, bottom up, this grassroots innovation is an essential part of AI adoption, but it's both enabled by the culture from the top and unlocked by the mandate from the top. And now going straight to answer your question directly, Alina, middle management is where that communication happens to Daniel's point, because they do two essential roles. First, they cascade strategy down. So if senior management wants to foster AI adoption, it's ultimately the line manager that makes it real. It's the line manager that models AI use, that recognizes and celebrates AI use in their team, that creates that innovation microculture, that directs people to available support, that adjusts expectations and allows time for experimentation instead of sort of punishing people like, stop playing around, we have deadlines to meet, right? And it's the middle management, the line manager, that does that classic people management of making them feel that their concerns and fears have been heard, that makes people feel empowered rather than forced to use AI. So there's both the kind of the technical element, how do you make sure that the mandate is cascaded down, but there's also this people management element, which I think is something that's often forgotten, actually, that right now managers at all levels, senior, middle, whatever, they need to be both really good strategic business managers, and they also need to be really good people managers to be able to help people for that transition. And they also, like the other role that they play, because at first we talked about cascading from the top down, the other role that they play is surfacing AI adoption and the feedback that they get from people adopting AI from the bottom up. And they're helping answer questions such as what are the concerns that need to be addressed by the leadership? What cracks are showing that need attention? For example, in one organization that I spoke with, their people were mandated to use AI, but the tools were too rudimentary to be useful. And that was somehow either not communicated or it was not listened to, which eventually bred a lot of cynicism and resentment about AI, and that they are still dealing with it right now. On the brighter side, managers are the ones who can identify what wins should be celebrated at the company level, what innovations are popping up that should be noticed and scaled across the company. So the way I think about managers, they are like the synapses of AI transformation. They carry leadership's intent down and they send real signals back up, and they decide whether that transformation actually fires in everyday work, to extend the analogy. And they absolutely need to be specifically addressed in any AI transformation. So it's again, we can probably go into more detail in terms of what the component parts of it are, of the transformation and training it, enablement, capability building, and so on. But for managers, at the very least, they need to be involved. They need to be trained how to lead people through the transformation. You need to get their buy-in, because they are the ones that are ultimately accountable for teams' performance, and they need to be you need to get their buy-in so that they do not block the AI adoption because they have competing incentives. They need to be empowered because ultimately they'll need serious skill to lead teams for a lot of uncertainty and change.
Absolutely, and I think we've got a great question. Thank you, Aaron. You've put one in the chat, and he's asked, do you have any thoughts on how senior leaders should reimagine their existing processes and workforce to be more AI native? And he said, you can't just add AI to our existing way of working and see an impact. Now, I think this is a really interesting one, and just to kind of kick off and let's discuss this one for a moment. I've always, my work on innovation in the past, and actually also in kind of, when we think about learning as a developmental continuum, you have kind of, pre-awareness, right? And then you have getting to grips with something. And as you become more expert in it, you can see where the opportunities for innovation are. And then as that sort of expertise and innovation capability grows, you can then do more with it, right? So when we think about that that idea of being AI native, I think there's potentially an underlying foundational capability around how we work, how we actually articulate our work, the why, the what, and the how. Because in my experience, everyone will know the Simon Sinek thing about people not knowing their why. The vast majority of organizations that I've worked with, they're at really varying levels of their articulation of their how. So when we think about there's that kind of, how do we add AI on top of what we're already doing? If you haven't got the what and the how super refined and clear, and you don't have methods for continually innovating that, you're kind of potentially creating a more, whether you bring in the AI upskilling or not, you might not be adding it in a way that is as beneficial as it could be. So I just wonder whether any of you, Daniel, should we come to you if you've got any thoughts on that? I've gone quite passionate about that need for that innovation capability as a general concept across the whole organization, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
No, I think that, yeah, precisely. I think the way I frame it is the problem right now, and it's funny, like, I think to some degree people are thinking there's something fundamentally new about AI transformation. Yes, the scale, the penetration is different because it's a general purpose technology, but it's remarkable how many of the same old problems with just general technology and digital transformation coming with AI. And what's happening right now, and I think this is more so with AI because it's general purpose, is there's a very, let's say, AI leading approach, tech leading approach. And I think if you're thinking as a senior leader, it needs to be reverse. It needs to be organizational leadership based approach. And what do I mean by that? It goes back to very fundamentals. What is the problem you're trying to solve? What are your assumptions? Really simple to that degree. And I've noticed where it goes really off is people have tried stuff without really thinking about what is it fundamentally the problem I'm having difficulty I want to solve, and what are my underlying assumptions. I mean, as an example outside of AI, but it gives the point. I'll give you two examples. One very, very not high tech, one very high tech, but both in the global south. The whole movement around frugal innovation was this. So it started with the idea was, the assumption was, if you wanted to do something cheaper and more efficient, you take an existing thing and break it up. But what frugal innovation fundamentally does is question, what is it fundamentally I'm trying to achieve, and builds it bottom up. So that's how the Tata Nano started. It wasn't taking an existing car and just shedding it and adding. It was, wait a minute, what does the car fundamentally need to do? Maybe it needs to accelerate, brake, and building it from bottom up. So it's about the assumption. The other one, funny enough, is if you get to look at, there's a community network in Egypt called the Zabelines, called the garbage people. And their whole basis of operating is a fundamental difference of what waste means. So most of us, when we think of trash, it's out of sight, out of mind, throw it somewhere. Their view is actually, I can produce everything. So for them, the fundamental meaning is trash is gold. So they'll go and buy precious trash. They build their entire network around that. So how do I bring this into AI? What is the problem you're trying to solve? And what are the assumptions? If you're trying to take AI into an existing way, precisely why it doesn't work, to Aaron and others' points, is that you're using existing assumptions pre-AI and thinking AI can just be bolted on. AI itself operates and processes things fundamentally different than what some organizations do. You need to understand what the assumptions are you're making, and is that tied to the problem? And so when you have a more problem organizational-led approach, you're going to have much more success because you're questioning the fundamental taken for granted assumptions up front, as opposed to hoping that it will fit your existing understandings, when by definition is a technology that's novel. So it's just something to keep in mind. And this is something I think for digital transformation in general as well.
I absolutely agree. And so I think actually, potentially my response to Aaron's question would be, it's not necessarily about being AI native. Of course, we want everyone to be capable with it, but it's more about being innovation native. And I think that problem identification piece is really, really critical for innovation, because within the same organization, we used in one of my previous slides, we used to teach problem identification as a methodology for discovery-driven learning, right? Which is like sort of the foundation of innovation. And actually within an organization, and this is where the human-centered and kind of inclusive approach is critical, because Daniel and I might be working in the same organization, but my perception is that the problem is A, but actually from Daniel's perspective, the problem is actually B, C, and D. There's 3 different problems. And so making sure that you're solving the right problems and then deciding where to add AI on top. And actually you can build these capabilities, those kind of innovation methods and approaches and design thinking approaches, you can build them into your skills and performance matrices within an organization. Be very happy. That's a whole different conversation. Very happy to have that conversation another time, and any of you can reach out. But just before I come to you, Egla, James, you've gone from 0 to kind of coding capabilities, and when you worked with the Ministry of Defence, I'd love to just get your perspective on how you really kind of build those more tech native workforces, and just tell everyone a little bit about some of the work you did when you were with the Ministry of Defence.
Sure, and I'll try and dock this onto Aaron's question as well, because I think it's a really good one. And let me start with that. I actually partly disagree with what Aaron said, and the way I'll just frame this is, when you say you can't just add AI to our existing way of working and see an impact. Well, I think you can. I think, if you give people Gen AI tools now, they will have a time saving. I think that's almost unarguable, but the changes are incremental, right? You get people more effective at meeting transcription, note taking, dealing with some of this organizational sludge. They use it as an idea sparring partner. You end up with incremental improvements. I think what you've been talking about there, Alina, and that Daniel's been talking about, and then I think Aaron's getting at, is you can't have those sort of transformational impacts where you change how your customers experience your platform, if you're a software company, or how the world perceives you. You can't have those or how your entire organization operates. You can't have those transformational impacts without very top-down, vision-heavy, leadership-driven interventions. But we have to realize they're much slower, and they have to be really deliberate. So it doesn't, one doesn't have to come without the other, right? You can incrementally improve your workforce's productivity right now by rolling out Gen AI. And if you do it properly, I think the gains are unarguable, but incremental. But you can also try some transformational programs as well, right? And see where they come to. So to answer your question, Alina, and just bring out a few experiences here. So when I was in the MOD, I was really fortunate to get to build an AI scheme in the military to upskill soldiers and sailors and aviators back in 2018. And it was lots of similar conversations to now, right? A lot of people saying, well, hey, what's the point in giving a load of soldiers and sailors and aviators coding skills? That seems mad. Well, what are they going to do with those skills? And of course, most of the 6,000 people we upskilled over the next couple of years didn't do much with them, right? They gained a little bit of a exposure to what software was and what it could do and what it might mean for the future of defense. I think we're seeing that means quite a lot for the future of defense now we look in Ukraine. But then you've got a small portion of these people, a relatively significant portion, who really kicked on and started building software and AI solutions. And at this point, it was very much traditional machine learning solutions to the problems they faced. And though it was a relatively small number in the end that actually took things to production, the relative impact of those people was actually pretty transformational on how the MOD now does business. And I think, that's hopefully a bit of a plug for the fact that bottom-up transformation doesn't need to remain small. If middle managers do their job really well and execs do their job well too, you can find these pockets of incredible innovation that if you invest in them, you can scale them up quite dramatically. And obviously your old organization, Alina, was pretty pivotal to that too. But it takes a good culture to do that. And MOD doesn't always have the most conducive culture to innovation, but it has pockets of good bits. And yeah, it requires letting 1,000 flowers bloom and realizing that most of them aren't going to survive the winter. So hopefully that's some thoughts on,
No, thank you. Thank you, James. And what James is mentioning there is more of MOD took a tri-tier approach for a big innovation learning program, which took the senior leaders from across the whole piece, the enablers of innovation. And it was a big leadership development program around how they enable the conditions for success. But then you had the middle tier who were the drivers of it, the deliverers and drivers of innovation. So training them up in all of those innovation and methodologies and prototyping, all that kind of thing to really drive it forwards. And then you've got the kind of universal approach. So it was having that whole organizational approach comes at it. You have the ability to create ecosystem insights that you share that communication between the different tiers. And there's a big clarity and alignment opportunity there. I think just to go, we've got a great question from Helen. So aligned to Graham's question before, how do we manage experimentation of new tools and agents? And I think this speaks to so let's say you take this, everyone's doing this bottom-up approach. We've got this wide-scale adoption happening. Now, we should come to those metrics around ROI before the conversation wraps, because just because everybody's using it doesn't mean it's useful. So what are the best examples that we can share for everybody listening and watching in terms of how organizations are really identifying those excellent use cases and examples? Egla, should we come to you first for this one?
I was just looking at Helen's question, so not necessarily directly answering what in terms of use cases, but just generalized insights about how we manage experimentation alongside the desire to manage risk and protect data, which is, I think, a question on everyone's minds. Is that first, I think it's important to be realistic, and first of all, define how you define risk, because it might be that there's real risk of data leaks, that kind of in infosec, or is what you think of risk as just waste of time, that sort of thing. So first of all, define that, then be realistic, because you cannot you cannot engage in that kind of bottom-up experimentation without tweaking some of the ways the organization reacts to risk, because there are certain parts of the organization whose job is to protect the organization from risk, which is IT, which is legal, and using the existing frameworks, that experimentation might not um, not be as fast and as successful. Let's put it like that. To give you an example, with a large company, it took them like a year to sign off a simple coaching tool using the existing frameworks that they had. So first of all, with risk, you need to be realistic that the organization, it's not just how about you add this whole AI adoption onto the existing framework, but also the organization needs to understand what it is willing to flex on, because it needs to have some flexibility there. Again, not exposing the organization to the great risk, but not maximizing, watertight, 100% nothing bad is going to happen kind of situation. It's also very important to communicate to people the do's and don'ts, because what I've noticed is happening often is that the sort of the ethics and the compliance part of AI is often treated as a compliance exercise, sort of like, here is learn, it's like a data privacy course, and then let's go into AI experimentation. But actually, it needs to be a communication exercise. It's something that people are going to be, it has to be on top of people's minds. If they're using AI daily, several times a day, or like 10, 20 times a day, they need to constantly know the edges of the sandbox. So yeah, treat not as compliance, but as a whole internal communication exercise. And then, of course, the tools need to be secured as well. For example, I spoke with a consulting company, and obviously for client-facing companies, security is paramount. Like this is their key thing. So they created their entire tech stack internally. And they have actually created a culture, this kind of everything that we're talking about, top down, bottom up. They have actually created that kind of environment. But also the foundation was creating all of their own tools, so that they know that nothing's going out of the company, and everything that people have access to, that is just secure, and we have enough like technical guardrails so that people who shouldn't access certain things, they cannot access them.
Absolutely, thank you. Daniel, I don't know if you've got anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, sure. In terms of balancing, integrating kind of what Helen said, Graham, I have some key things that I think will be helpful, and then we have to think more bigger level about the kind of mindset change based on the nature of uncertainty. But back to the point of like what I would start with literally is, what is my problem, or what is the task I'm interested in, what's my goal, right? And then from that, you need to ask yourself, what are the assumptions I'm making to go from the task I want to do to the goal? And as much as you can, test those assumptions. And I would start from a security standpoint, start with things that could use public data where you know what the answer should be. Put it into generative AI, and if it's giving you something different, why is that? Then you get a really good sense of what are the limitations in the model. So in my view, when you test assumptions, that means trying to push these models till they break using public data. So that way you can say, okay, here is kind of where it works, where it doesn't. Oh, if I give generative AI a math equation, it's going to read it like text and it will get it wrong. Versus if I do emails, it's text, etc. Get a feel. Once you've built the kind of knowledge, then the next step would be, can I use I would use closed form models. I would try to use things that you can download the model locally and train it. Now, how do you do that? Get on the fact that Graham said you don't know what you don't know. I really, and one of the things we've mentioned is I really prioritize translation or intergenerational teaming. You need teams that have a diversity of industry and AI experience. If you just have industry experience, people don't understand what these AI tools can do. If you just have the AI tools, people are just going to use them with the assumption of what's going to be relevant. So having those teams work together to download the models, train it, then you could start using maybe low risk data, things that are you don't want to leak, but if it leaks, the damage is less problematic. Okay, so just things of that kind of aspect. Then from that, some set of pilots will probably emerge that you want to try. Now you have to think about triaging them, which is what Egla mentioned. The problem is if you put it through the existing framework, you're going to slow track everything. So you want some things, you agree on a set of rules that we're going to fast track some things, slow track other things. And now through it all, now this is the point everyone's just going to have to make peace with. There's two forms of uncertainty when you're dealing with AI. One that's called epistemic uncertainty, which is things that are knowable. For example, someone giving you intentionally fabricated information. In theory, if my models could work well, I should be able to know the intent in theory. Now, there's other ones, which is I'm trying to take existing data and predict something in the future. There's no way you can possibly know every outcome. There's some stuff that's stochastic. So you're going to have both with AI, stuff that are knowable and stuff that just stochastic. And so you have to have a mindset change of the following. You need to realize that you can try to reduce some forms of uncertainty, and others you have to make peace that you just don't know what you not know. And the mindset becomes one of mitigation. Things will go wrong. How do I quickly stop the bleeding? As opposed to just worrying about reducing all the uncertainty. That means think about a rapid response force that can come together quickly, like a task force, when an emergency happens. What are the thresholds by which that emergency becomes a serious disruption that we activate this? We have another framework called S cubed where we try to think about that in a cognitive system. Now, that's that. The other thing you want to do through it all is organizations have a remarkable ability to forget. So you need to codify what you're learning in an information system somewhere where people can find easily, and you do it at the moment, not after the pilot's done as lessons learned, because then we all sorts of retrospection comes in. Oh, this is what we think we knew at the time. Do it at the moment through regular reviews. So to summarize very quickly, start with very typical problems and goals. Test your assumptions first with public data to really understand where these models can break. Start with lower risk ideas with things that you're not so worried about leakage, but do it with a downloadable model that's not one that's pinging a server of ChatGPT or whatever. You'll have a set of pilots. Then you have to decide which ones you're going to fast track and slow track. What are the rules you want to use? Throughout, you need to codify the knowledge, and you're going to have a mindset change, which is, yes, reduce uncertainties that you can reduce, but making peace with the fact that with any transformation, things can go wrong, and you quickly stop the bleeding, and you build your tuning mechanisms to do it. What threshold or indicator, whatever it is, when it reaches that alert level, that's when we activate. And that could be from prior experience, prior transformations, and the like. But that's what I would think about as a structured way to think of it. Start small with pilots. Executives come in when they really want to support certain ones, activate some quick, rapid response around emergencies.
Thank you so much, Daniel. James, you threw your hand up there. So would you like to jump in on that one?
I should be really brief. I just wanted to give three tactical additions to this. From the organizations we work with, it comes down to three things to answer Helen's question very, very tactically. If you're going to allow bottom-up AI innovation, which I recommend you do. One, AI tool choice. Two, AI tool settings. And three, like roughly where your risk appetite is as a company, which comes into Egla's sort of 2x2 grid earlier on like how innovative and risky you want to be. On tool choice, I think there's just so many myths flying about on the security of things like Copilot and Gemini and stuff. I have to remind a lot of execs the security of Microsoft Copilot, even the free version, as long as it's within your tenant, is the same as using Microsoft Word in the cloud. I think people have got themselves wrapped around the axle that their data is training some random far-off model. It isn't. And people start building their own internal tools. My view of people's internal chatbots, and in my experience, is they're rubbish. And it creates a new massive risk for you, which is that everyone uses ChatGPT because your own one's totally useless. Is my experience. And like people obviously want to ignore that risk, but it's actually, I think, a massive risk that then people use ChatGPT without turning off data training, which is obviously only 3 clicks if you want to turn it off. The second one on tool settings, we see a very similar pattern with a lot of customers. One, they start with chat. They roll out the free version of, Copilot or Gemini or whatever and start with chat. Then they start encouraging people to build really simple agents that they can only use personally but not publish. And then they build up the confidence and processes to start productizing some of those agents and get to those higher value use cases. And that seems to be quite a well-trodden path that we're seeing the best organizations kind of go down. And then thirdly, on the honest risk appetite thing, we find this fascinating. We do lots of exec sessions, as I'm sure Egla and Daniel do, where we bring up the question of, hey, how do you think about this as a company? What's your risk appetite like for if 100 of your people built an agent tomorrow? And it's very, very revealing when you get a group of execs in the room because they don't agree often, which is fascinating. It's a great time to have those conversations when they're together before IT invariably writes a policy which is the most risk averse it could possibly be. And generally, what we find is that the CEO and the execs are excited and really want some gains from AI, and therefore they're willing to sign off a higher risk tolerance than the IT director or CIO or CTO could ordinarily do themselves. So they're my 3 tips for people very tactically. Choose a good tool. I would not bet against a 300 billion, dollar behemoth and build your own because it's going to be rubbish in comparison generally. 2, there are well-trodden patterns for permissioning on these sort of things and settings. And thirdly, have that honest conversation. Bring someone super smart in like Egla to help you have that conversation. And have an honest chat about where is your risk appetite with this sort of thing. Do you want to unlock the floodgates? And who knows, you might actually be disappointed that not much comes through them. But where is your risk appetite? Hopefully that brings it a bit more tact.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. And just before we start to wrap for the conversation, it's flown by and we've only got about 10 minutes left, but we do have a question. We started talking about agents at the start. And just again, for that clarification and alignment piece, we've got another question from Aaron. He said, can you talk about the different ways that people interact with AI agents and what is the difference between human in the loop and human above the loop, on the loop, etc.? Could we just, Daniel, do you want to have a first pass at just explaining the difference between those things? Because again, jargon, lots of chat about this at the moment, lots of noise. And you feel free to pass that baton on if you'd like someone else to jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy for others to jump in. I was going to stop, actually, just if you don't mind, Elena, there was a question above that I thought was important. Intan asked a question, what are some early indicators that a workforce transformation initiative is driven by AI is heading in the wrong direction or right one? I think what's interesting is if the strategy is focused solely on efficiency and automation, I would argue that's where you're starting to get issues. Because what the problem is now is there's been so much push on efficiency, and the occupations that have pushed the automation aspect, you do see reductions in junior level employees. Interestingly, though, the studies that have shown, if you think about it from the perspective of augmentation, which is not just replacing, but how I can do my existing work better, then actually those occupations that do that, they've seen really no change in employment. Now that signals something important. If it's just efficiency, one, there's a couple of issues with that. One is it doesn't excite people to just think about how to like cut work. Some of it you want to have a narrative about what you're going to use this save time for. What are we going to do in terms of new value, new ideas? Every transformation has a replacement effect, which is what we've been focused on, but also reinstatement effect. So think about banking. When the ATM came in, yes, there was some job loss, but the bankers that stayed had a lot more complex work. They're not going and just giving you money from the bank. You could do that now with the ATM. We need to think much more carefully about what is augmenting. So in terms of early indicators, I think the places where they just focus on the efficiency or aspects and just those indicators, already there's, I think, some issue. Funny enough, which is I haven't seen a lot of, this is a huge opportunity, particularly for manufacturing firms. Because one of the things when new technologies come in and automation comes in, it always becomes a fight between the managers and organized labor, like labor unions. If you change the conversation and the indicators around where we want to automate in a way that's feasible and desirable, what's interesting, you can get organized labor and managers actually on the same side of the table. And actually it could be a really good way of building trust and relation with unionized labor in a way that helps you. And I don't think people have talked about that much because they've been so focused on the efficiency and then it becomes a very adversarial conversation of how much are you going to pay me? Why are we doing this and that? But if you spend time thinking about where do we want to automate, there's so much low-hanging fruit that won't meet organizational resistance and offer so much new value. So I would say in terms of indicators, if you're noticing that all the metrics are efficiency led, percent produced, percent hours saved, stuff like that, I think that if that's just the sole one, obviously it's in the portfolio, then things could be heading in the wrong dimension, as opposed to new value generated, new knowledge disseminated. So even the very construction of your indicators, if you see the momentum going one place, that may not be, or you may already be heading to that, as opposed to even just what those metrics are percentage wise.
I would say, and just to build on that as well, I think, and we've alluded to this throughout the conversation, I think it's what is it that the organization really wants to innovate? Like, what does everybody think are the biggest problems, that biggest opportunities that you want to embrace, and where is AI, the answer or not the answer for that? And then think about how you want to measure the problem solving and the opportunity embracement, along the way. James, any thoughts on any or response to Aaron's question about the kind of the agents and human in the loop, on the loop, etc.? I think there's a request there for a bit of a definition. Because there's a spectrum, isn't there, of how agents run in terms of human interaction, and we talked about this earlier, didn't we, in terms of you're letting it run off and do things, and we talked about the guardrails needed for that. So I think just for the clarification piece, it'd be great just to clarify that.
Yeah, I think I'd struggle to give you the textbook definition of those terms, because I just don't encounter them in real work. But I think the crux of Aaron's question is right for a leader to be thinking about. The last bit, which is how do you decide the right human agent approach? I think that's the more interesting sort of question here. Obviously human in the loop means that a human's going to check or approve the work, and human above the loop and on the loop means that they're slightly less involved in that decision making, obviously. But yeah, I think his final question is a really interesting one. And, I think it depends what the stakes are, right? With the problem that you're having human and agent collaborate on. If the stakes are really high in my old world in defense, if there's a life or death decision at the end of this, then of course you're going to want a very strong degree of assurance from a human taking accountability for a really consequential action. Whereas if it's, something pretty low consequence, or that humans mess up a lot of the time, looking at bags being scanned in an airport, famously humans, miss a massive percentage of dangerous items going through them. It's probably okay to swing the pendulum towards the agent having more autonomy there. So I think that's the more interesting question for me. And sorry to disappoint Aaron that I can't give a textbook definition of the others, but it's just simply a spectrum of how much humans are actually involved.
The risk involved, but also potentially testing. It's the testing and development approach as well, so that the human is more in the loop as you're developing the agents potentially, or just the use of Gen AI in general, and you can let it do more as confidence grows, with the right guardrails in place. Daniel, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I do want to get one last kind of soundbite from everybody.
I'll be brief. I mean, my understanding of in, on, and above is, if you think of in, it's you are negotiating how you're doing the work with some AI tool, right? Am I doing it together? Am I sequencing, etc.? On the loop gets some more like you're directly supervising the work. You're like on it, meaning you're looking at the line, etc. Above is much more oversight. So it essentially, the variance is based on if you're more in, you're dealing with the work and you're thinking about the tasks. As you go on or above, it's more about governance and oversight. So essentially the way you have to think through it is, what is the right governance overlooking all of this versus the right tools to actually do the work, either in tandem with the agents, sequentially, whatnot. And so I think that boils down to precisely what James said, performance stakes. It also boils down to trust. How much trust do people have in the tools that are used, which will be coming from your experimentation? And also some of it just the stringency of culture and requirements. If I'm a government agency, I got to be much more careful of the spec I use, as opposed to maybe another organization that can be more flexible. And that will help you decide how much tightening you give on the constraints of the agents in it, how much you are going to let them do the stuff autonomously, as well as, is there perceived trust? And this is actually a kind of interesting frontier around agents and stakeholders. So thinking about stakeholders in relation to how you do that is what I see that trend is. That's my definition. Everyone has their own.
Thank you so much. And 60 seconds each on what you think will distinguish organizations that thrive in the next phase of AI development. I'm being very mean. Egla.
Okay, really quickly. One, willing to redesign workflows instead of just sprinkling AI on top. Second, leaders who are willing to invest in their own capability, not just delegating adoption, but actually tinkering, understanding what's possible, and letting that knowledge reshape the way they think about AI, their assumptions, their judgment. So allowing themselves to participate in the change, not just delegating it. And the third one is having a point of view on how the business, how the work is going to change so that you can lead them towards the vision. So from the current point to the end point, rather than take the current point and sort of inch in various directions wherever the latest development takes you.
Well, I think that was less than 60 potentially. James, coming to you now.
I love a lot of what Egla said there. I think my takeaway would be that if you empower your workforce with the skills to harness Gen AI now, they can have a lot of incremental improvements in how they work. But crucially, and we didn't talk about L&D today, but crucially, this isn't like training someone to use a SaaS tool, a software tool. It's a bit more than typing into the box. To have people get the most out of the tools and transform how they work as individuals, you need to help them reimagine how they work. And we spend a lot of time trying to personalize our learning to learners because we think this is the core problem. The core problem people face isn't knowing how to type into the box and click send. It's trying to work out, what do I do with this PhD level intern in every subject that's tireless and sometimes hallucinates, and how do I do my best work faster now I have this? So yeah, invest in bottom up upskilling and set your people free to experiment within bounds.
Brilliant, thank you. And Daniel?
Yeah, really quick. I think the organization that'll be most effective will be the ones leading the algorithms, not letting the algorithms lead them. Okay, so that's the way to think of it. I think that's 2 points. One is then that means you have to spend a lot of time learning where you want to accept AI output and where you want to deny it. So where to have FOMO and vision, fear of missing out, but where one of my colleagues will say where to also have JOMO, joy of missing out. So you need both. And then the third one is just simply, when is it maybe good enough to use small data and when is it to use big data? Because if you're a specialist organization leading on the cutting edge of oncology, you don't necessarily need ChatGPT trained on Reddit posts. Simple as that.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you to everybody for joining today. My takeaways really are all around those, that ideas from everywhere, but with some sensible guardrails. Make sure you invest in your middle managers, cascading all those messages, and identify, the high performers or the high performance use cases that you can really think about how you're going to scale, and also think about those innovation kind of skills that underpin all of this, and fundamentally reimagining the workflows and the way everybody's going about their everyday work. I'm going to put my email in the chat before we close. Please do, panelists, if you're up for sharing those. And yeah, this has been an exciting conversation. We could go on a lot longer, but we'll say goodbye for now.